Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This is the fifth virtual conversation in the Representation Matters program, Your Vote Counts. This series is hosted by the George Washington Carver Museum and Cultural Center, a cultural institution dedicated to honoring African American heritage, arts, and culture in Arizona, and Arizona Humanities, the Arizona affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Since 1973, Arizona Humanities has supported public programs that promote understanding of the human experience with cultural, educational, and nonprofit organizations across Arizona. This program was funded by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Our speaker this evening is Adrian Fontes, the 29th Maricopa County Recorder, attorney, honorably discharged veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, and current Chief Deputy Recorder in Tucson. Now, before we get started and I turn it over to Adrian, for the best viewing option in this webinar, you'll want to be in the full screen setting. So you should be able to toggle that in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Throughout the talk, please add any questions you have in the Q&A function, and that's going to be located at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote other people's questions if you'd like them to be asked. And I do have a chat enabled, so feel free to add any comments or interact with each other during this talk. Today's session will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on the Carver Museum website at carveraz.org, and we'll also have links directing you there through our own website, azhumanities.org. All right, Adrian, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, first of all, to ASU Humanities and everyone involved in the planning here, and of course, Julianne, for making sure that we're all plugged in. And I want to, first of all, make sure that everybody sort of gets the context here. This is really, I think, one of the most important moments in our nation's history. Democracy is really being tested. And the United States of America is truly an experiment that is reaching sort of one of those critical points where we're either going to go one direction or the other. And it's up to every single one of us to understand that. You know, we are one of the first instances in all of human history where we have real sort of this egalitarian look towards one person having one vote that is equal across culture, socioeconomics, gender, ability, everything, right? All of those things that would separate folks in other societies through human history. So I think it's really important that we keep this sort of in context. That being said, it is the talk of the day. And one of the first questions that I was asked to discuss was, why is voting in the news every day? Well, this didn't just happen overnight. I think there is a little bit of history here. I'm going to take a stab at about 3 or 4 different questions here, and I'll be stopping after each one a little bit to see if we've got any questions on that particular subject. But why is really voting, I guess, in the news every day right now is important to start with the idea that elections and the way that we vote have never been static. If anybody ever tells you, oh, this is how we used to do it, and this is how we've always done it, they're just flat wrong. You know, we didn't have secret ballots in the United States at all until the 1830s, and then they were imported from Australia. The Massachusetts ballot was actually the Australian ballot originally. There used to be ballots that were printed by the political parties, brought in by voters themselves. And folks would know who you were voting for by the color of paper that you were putting into the ballot box in your precinct. And so, you know, these concepts are real. Obviously, we all know that, you know, it's just over 100 years ago that women were allowed into the franchise. And the idea of franchise itself is important because the word comes from a pre-United States of America idea where folks who owned bits of land around a company town, for example, the North Carolina Company, or any towns that were incorporated, those landowners actually had a right to pay taxes and thereby gain profits off of the land. That's what gave you the right to vote. It wasn't about your skin color or your gender so much. Eventually those did come into play, but limits on who could vote were really based in economics. Those were the folks who were paying taxes in. We didn't have sales taxes then. We didn't have anything but property tax. There was no income tax. So those were the folks who were part of the franchise, if you will. So the idea of voting in democracy is an idea in the United States of America that is constantly shifting, constantly changing. And it's the one constant that we know we can always depend on. Who votes, who has the right to vote, has changed over and over and over again. But why is it really a big deal now? Well, we can go back not too long, maybe about 20 years, to the 2000 election. You know, the way it was conducted in Florida, what ended up happening, the Bush v. Gore case in the United States Supreme Court made voting and elections sort of a deal for the moment, right? And there's always been the fights around redistricting. There's always been the fights around politics and legislatures, but the act of voting and the idea of casting a ballot was never really as important as it is now. And if you ask me, I think that really started back in 2015, not that long ago. And it started with an idea on the other side of the political aisle from where a lot of the controversy seems to arise now. It doesn't take a long trip down memory lane to remember that it was the Bernie Sanders campaign back in 2015 who was complaining about the DNC's superdelegate way of running their elections, and that the superdelegates were going to toss the election for that nominee. They were going to toss the nominee to Hillary Clinton because she was going to have all the superdelegates locked up, and it was undemocratic. And you know, those of us who were around in 2016 and really engaged in that campaign, full disclosure, I was a delegate for Senator Sanders in 2016. So, you know, it was coming from some folks on that side. We're really complaining about, is democracy democratic? But one of the other things that started happening, that started in the summer of 2015 into the fall, really got heavy in the winter of 2015, 2016. Then we started hearing things about foreign nations getting involved in the administration of our elections, or they were hacking the election. And in the summer of 2016, and right after the conventions, we really started getting to know that there were foreign actors who were actively engaged on social media and in other places. And after the election in November, we found out for sure 17 different agencies said that there was some hacking in the election. And so that's really when this idea of, is our vote really secure? Is our vote really safe? Became more and more of a political football. And some people decided to take advantage of that. Some people really wanted to make sure that they were casting doubt in our electoral process. This is dangerous, and I am going to make a judgment call on it in a minute. If it doesn't sound like I'm going to, then you're not listening closely enough, but I will. But what we ended up seeing was sort of this fomenting of this mythology that there were real problems in the administration of American elections by American election officials. That's the mythology. That's the problem. But since a lot of Americans really don't pay very close attention to a lot of these things, because let's face it, the administration of elections is not the most sexy thing in the world. I'll be the first one to admit it, having been there and having done that. But at the end of the day, when you move through 2017 into 2018 and so forth, we see a lot of the security concerns. We see a lot of sort of around the country people casting doubts on systems. And right here in Maricopa County, I was running the elections. We had some hiccups, like hiccups happen all over the place. This is the second largest voting jurisdiction in the country. We had a system that was completely outdated and had been slated for replacement. We utilized that system and made some improvements in the system, but it wasn't the smoothest road. And we ended up conquering all of the issues from August of 2018 and 2020, into November of 2018. But again, the question is, why is voting in the news so much? That's because it is becoming more and more and more a topic of discussion. Our leadership is talking about it. They started talking about it back in the 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. We've got the next sort of midterm elections. There is some shifting in power in Washington, D.C. And then we start moving into the 2020 election season. And guess what? We've got one candidate who says, if there is a loss on my part, then there's fraud. And he's got a good chunk of the people in this country believing that. And so why is it a topic of discussion? Because our leaders talk about it. And that's what leadership does. Good leaders, well, let's just say all leaders, have the ability to bring an issue to the fore and to get folks to talk about that issue and to get folks to focus on that issue. And so, with that history in mind, it is no wonder that voting and elections are at the top of our minds. The media is focusing in on it. It can be a very easy story to tell: A versus B, fraud versus not fraud, good system versus bad system, who's winning, who's losing. That horse race is really sexy, and it's simple for the media to tell a story there. And so we want to talk about it. We want to talk about something that I think the vast majority of us know are really good, solid, secure systems. All of the reasonable folks who have, sort of looked at this from any legitimate perspective understand that American elections are safe, they are secure. In fact, Donald Trump's own appointee to CISA said that the 2020 election was the most secure election in the history of elections. But the idea then is the whole conversation around voting continues, and it is foisted by folks who didn't like the outcome. And that's just not a good thing. That's not an American way to do things. An American way to do things would be, you take it on the chin, you move along to the next election, and you go forward. But it is critically important that we have the discussion, because it is something that a lot of people are talking about right now. And I'll go ahead and see if there's any questions on that particular part of this talk right now, because I think I'm up on my pause moment. Julianne is making sure we run a tight ship here.
I don't think we have any questions yet, but I have a quick one for you. Thinking about voting happening in the news, do you see, sort of something positive happening with so many people discussing voting now? Do you think that it's helping increase voter turnout now that it's in the news, or do you think it's mostly clouded by all the controversy?
Well, controversy brings attention, and I think that election administrators across the United States of America will agree. We had one of the roughest and most challenging election seasons through 2020 that just about anybody has seen. And we're talking about career professionals who've been at this for 30 and 40 years. We're saying the same thing. And it was a combination of the political atmosphere and the fact that, oh, by the way, we were flat in the middle of a global pandemic. And yet, legislatures, election administrators, boards of commissioners, boards of supervisors, election boards, whoever the officials were across the country made major adjustments to get voters voting. And it became an issue. It became a let's get turnout up. And again, as I indicated before, when leaders lead, people will follow. And a lot of people were trying to get as many folks as possible voting across all demographics, all economics, all states. A lot of changes were made. And some folks wanted to capitalize in a negative way on those changes. But at the end of the day, 2020 had the largest turnout in history. And in Maricopa County, for example, we had 600,000 more ballots cast between 2016 and 2020. And that's with 2.6 million voters. We went from 2.1 to 2.6 million. So we not only added 500,000 voters, but we got 600,000 more ballots cast. So I think people talking about it really is important. And that was one of the side benefits of the conversation, regardless of the controversy.
We have a couple questions that came in. Some from Brenda. It used to be that the US had such a poor record of voting, less than 25%. Now more people than ever are voting, seeking to engage in the process. Why is that bad, and is it?
Well, no, it's not a bad thing that more people are getting engaged. In fact, it's a good thing, because you really get the real voice. You really get the good opinions of the people about who they want their leaders to be. I mean, let's just look at Arizona. We had a large proportion of folks, a larger proportion of folks vote for Joe Biden than Donald Trump, and for Mark Kelly than Martha McSally for president and for U.S. Senate. But the rest of the state went red. The state legislature stayed in GOP hands in both the House and the Senate. In Maricopa County, countywide, Republicans swept the table except for the county sheriff's office. I even lost my election in that. And so what we had was a representation that one could easily say, well, gosh, there's more Republicans than Democrats. There's a whole bunch of independents, in fact, statewide more than Democrats. Could it be that a lot of Republicans didn't vote for the top of the ticket in those top two races, but came back to their party and stayed home in the rest? And if that's the case, then good. that's the will of the people, and more people voting will always give us a better idea of what we, the people, think. And so it's never bad to have a higher turnout. It's never bad to have sort of wonky results like that that seem counterintuitive, right? Should the top of the ticket had supported the bottom of the ticket more? Would that blue, Arizona turning blue storyline, which is not true, would that have bled further down into some of the other local races? Potentially, but it didn't, right? So the voters voted, their opinion got out there, it got counted, and we have a better, truer representation of what we, the people, think when more people turn out.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that response. We just got a couple more questions. Ralph
Sure.
is asking, why do we have a two-party system instead of a multi-party system? Is there a constitutional mandate that there be a two-party system?
So in fact, the idea of political parties does not even exist in the Constitution and was not necessarily contemplated by the founders. Frankly, I think they held the idea of political parties in some disdain. Many of them did. But at the end of the day, we have party systems because organizations work. When you get groups of people who are similarly motivated and they move forward with an idea and a plan and action, their cumulative efforts can add up to getting something done. It is teamwork. It is the American way. And if that manifests in the idea of a political party, and then those things morph into we've got one versus the other, well, then that's the way it works. You know, I talk to people all the time and they say, well, how do we make a difference? How do we make a change? Well, you got to organize, right? If you want your streets to be safer, you've got to get together with the rest of your neighbors and talk about it and figure out how to make it work. If you want your school districts to be better, then you've got to get together with more folks who pay taxes in those districts, who are registered to vote in those districts, and make the change happen. That's how this republic is built. It's built on the idea that we in groups can make things happen. Well, if you want to influence politically the power structure, then the group to be a part of is one of the two political parties. And the two political parties have organized well enough and fixed the rules well enough that we really have no explicit rule that only those two parties can exist. There is no explicit rule that there's only two parties, but there are rules surrounding the major parties. And that's why we have what we have, because they've crafted it well enough to maintain their own perpetuation moving forward. And, you know, that's what power begets. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I won't make a judgment call there. But that's the system that we have. And would it work better with a multi-party system? I don't know. We have plenty of examples around the world where multi-party parliamentary type systems just don't result in a ruling government. And they can have very, very significantly long periods of non-governance. And so all systems have their issues. And I think that's because they're run by humans. I think somebody once said that, you know, American democracy is the worst form of government when you bar all other forms of government.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We'll take another question this one's from Claudia. It seems like the Arizona legislature has put itself forward as a body that determines the winners of an election in Arizona. How is this being challenged, or how can it be challenged?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there was actually a piece of legislation introduced this time to do specifically that, to codify the idea that the electors in the race for the United States presidency could be certified or overturned by the Arizona legislature, which is what we would consider right now kind of silly, but it's not. I don't know that it would be unconstitutional, and I don't know that it would be illegal. We have to remember, we are not a nation that was built out of a revolution from another nation. Many other countries, in fact, almost all other countries in the world were built by a revolution stemming from liberation from a monarch, liberation from some other empire. We were 13 separate states with 13 separate legislatures and 13 separate governors who came together and then created the national government. So the posture at the very beginning of the power that the states maintain and retain within this republic from the beginning is very, very different. And let's not forget, it's even less than it was the first time we organized as a nation under the Articles of Confederation, which came before the Constitution. States had more power back then. And so really the Constitution puts limits on the government, but it also doesn't put a lot of limits on state governments, and state governments can do a whole lot of stuff. Now, we have had an evolution of laws and an evolution of cases that have put us into these certain parameters. And could something like that have been challenged? Yes, perhaps. But at the end of the day, we are independent states. We are sovereign states. We have separate criminal justice systems from the federal government. You can be prosecuted for the exact same crime in federal court and in state court because they are legally separate sovereigns. There are parts of the law that the federal government does not touch. Domestic relations, for example, family law. There is no federal statute for that. Water law, things that have to do with real property and stuff like that, that is generally reserved for the states. So states have a ton of power. Is it the right thing to do? Not in these days and times. Let's be clear. I don't pretend for a moment to advocate for the idea that the state governments or the legislature specifically should be usurping the power of the people. I'm not an advocate for that. But I certainly do think that there is a much broader conversation that has to be had, particularly when we talk to the Electoral College. Yeah.
Excellent. So thorough. Thank you so much. I see another question from Nancy in the chat. Is the right to a private ballot guaranteed?
Oh, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. The idea of the secret ballot, again, as I indicated earlier on, is an innovation into American electoral law. It came to us from Australia through Massachusetts, and it is it's not a unique thing, but it's a different thing than what it used to be. It used to be that you'd stand up and the politicians would come and talk to a crowd, and some folks would go this way and some folks would go that way, and then they would just count heads at the town hall or in the pub or in the basement of the church for local races and things of this nature. There are a whole host of regulations and statutes that make the ballot secret or make the ballot not attributable to an individual person. When you ask of whether or not, and I think it was phrased as a fundamental right, I would say no, it's absolutely not a fundamental right. The right to vote is fundamental. The right to secrecy of your ballot is far too technical to be a fundamental right, okay? So fundamental rights are the big ones, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, pray if you want, to who you want, how you want, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, things of this nature. Those are fundamental rights, kind of the big ones. The right to a secret ballot is probably codified in different ways in different states and different statutes all over the place. So does it make it a right? It could, depending on the circumstance and the state. Again, we've got 50 different sets of statutes among the states. So it's not a universal fundamental right, but it certainly is guaranteed in a variety of different ways across the United States of America.
That was a great question and great response. Thank you, Adrian. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A, but I do want to turn it back to you and get to your talk, and then we'll definitely address the rest of the questions in the Q&A in the next pause.
Sure. And the next thing I wanted to chat about was, why are local and national elections important? Or why is it important to vote in these elections? Well, I think generally speaking, the idea that we are a self-governing people is fundamental to the nature of the United States of America, the nature of this republic. If we are not self-ruling, then somebody else is doing it for us. Now, that speaks to a couple of different ideas on both sides of the political aisle, and I'd like to kind of highlight a couple of these things. In the first place, on one side of the political aisle, you can see that this is about including every person who contributes or doesn't. Just because the nature that they are a person here may have the right to vote, right? Just any citizen, for whatever reason, without limitation, should have the right to vote, should be able to vote easily, so on and so forth. Yes, absolutely. The other idea is that if you're not, then you shouldn't have the right to vote. And it's exactly the same idea on both sides of the aisle, but it's interesting the way one side will say it in a way that makes it exclusive that sort of puts it higher, the right to vote, on a pedestal, that purposefully pushes some people away. And the other one tries to include as many more people as possible. But I think fundamentally it's the exact same idea. We are self-governing citizens. Okay. The idea is that what the government does on our behalf, they do with our consent, they do with our blessing. And our consent and blessing is as a whole. It's not mine personally. I don't get to win every election, clearly. And it's not yours. You don't get to win every election. We get to decide together. And it's, in some ways, I heard a lot of people talking over the years about, oh, you got to vote, and you're letting people down if you don't vote. I see it more as it's a duty that you owe to the community. It is community involvement. People are always like, oh, well, I want to take care of my neighbors. I want to be civically engaged. Well, vote, right? Don't exclude your voice from the conversation. The voice that is your vote is critical to getting that truer voice of the whole people that I was talking about earlier, right? So why is it important to vote in national and local elections? I would argue it's far more important to vote in local elections than in national elections. Listen, in Maricopa County alone, where I'm assuming that a lot of the audience is from, this fall of 2021, the Maricopa County Elections Department is going to mail out over 1.5 million ballots in local elections for school district bonds and overrides. And every time I talk to a group, I tell them, you got to register voters. You got to make habitual voters out of folks out there. And this is a perfect example. Learn how to organize your people that are walking and knocking on doors, right? Political activism is important. The civic engagement is important. But it's important because without those bonds and overrides, schools don't have the appropriate funding that they need to actually function. Teachers don't get paid. Gymnasiums don't get redone. Libraries don't get restocked. Classrooms don't have air conditioning or proper plumbing or whatever classrooms need. I guess there's not a lot of plumbing in classrooms per se, but you get my point. So the idea, again, that we're a self-governing people requires people to self-govern. And if we don't use it, we're apt to lose it. Let's not forget, right now here in Arizona, we're in the middle of a really serious, seditious, neo-fascist movement to invalidate an election. On January 6, 2021, there was an armed coup attempt in the capital of the United States of America. There's no mincing words about that. We all know what it was. We saw it unfold on television. These folks wanted to go in and kidnap the vice president and the speaker of the House and stop a constitutional process and halt the peaceful transfer of power. That's not political. That's not one party versus the other. That's armed insurgents invading our national process. And we should all be very offended by that, because basically what they said was, your vote doesn't matter. They said it to the winners and the losers, because the winners and the losers, insofar as voters are concerned, they operated together to make that election happen. Let's not forget, there were thousands of Republicans and Democrats who stood shoulder to shoulder to make our American elections work. They were the poll workers, the judges, the auditors, the people who did all of the work across the United States of America. And these folks with guns went to the Capitol and said, none of that matters. None of that matters. We're going to, by violence, take this government. And that's serious stuff. And so by not voting, by being discouraged away from voting because of the controversy and because of the infighting and all this sort of stuff, like some people are just like, oh, it's too much, I just can't deal with it, and they turn away. That's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be directly engaging with our government every way possible, and most specifically the one way that matters the most. And that is when we tell the government who we want to lead us, when we tell them what policies we want them to move forward with. That's why voting at the local, state, and federal levels are all incredibly important, because we are a self-ruling people. And if we don't vote, we're not self-ruling. We're surrendering that mantle. We're surrendering that responsibility. And that's a terrible, terrible thing. And that's why I'm so glad, for the work that we did to bring so many more people and so many new voters in to the system. And that was a little shorter segment, but I think I went a little long on the first one. So Do you have any new questions before I go to the next one?
We don't have any new questions, but we do have a couple from your last section that we
Okay.
can address. Brenda's asking, why were polling places reduced? If more people than ever are voting, and we just heard from you about why it's so important to vote, why eliminate the places where they voted for decades?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and I would really challenge the idea that a smaller number of polling places means less access. That to me is sort of the premise of the question. That's not true. It's not necessarily true, because the idea of access, particularly in Arizona's elections, is far more complex. There's a lot more variables. Imagine one voter, one place for 13 hours, okay? In a traditional precinct-based polling place election where there's no early voting, all you have is your precinct for 13 hours from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. and that's it. That's 13 person hours of voting. Let's just call it that. Imagine then that you consolidate some of those precincts and you cut the entire number in half, but you increase the number of days that those polling places are available by 10. Now, how many voting hours do you have per voter? Let's say that 80% of your voters, 90% of your voters are getting a ballot in the mail. How many polling places do you actually need? Let's say now the example that we had in 2020, where not only do we expand early voting by a huge amount, and we've got an exponential growth in the number of opportunity hours, if you will, polling place hours for voters, including evenings and weekends. But we've got to do it in very large facilities because we're dealing with a global pandemic. And I mean stadium-sized facilities, right? Old department stores that had been vacated completely. This is what we had to do. And that's why we had higher turnout. We had higher turnout because we had better access. But the formula that a lot of people use is, well, if you're closing polling places, you're reducing access. That's not true, because it doesn't represent the reality on the ground. That is, how many hours, weekends, evenings do you have for people to get to a polling place that we focused on getting on mass transit lines, right? Bus lines and light rail lines that we, made sure that we did a lot of advertising for in a lot of places. These are the things that we took into consideration when we did that. And again, we had an amazing result, an amazing amount of turnout, and I was very proud for that. So did we reduce the number of polling places? Absolutely. We had every reason to do it, not the least of which was the health and safety of our poll workers, but also we increased access like nobody has ever seen. And those were the results. So again, traditional model, I get it, might not have been the best sounding thing to do, but if you're not looking at all of the factors, you're not getting the real answer to that formula.
Great, thank you so much. And Brenda says that makes sense, thank you. Definitely thinking about the voting process, as you said, that's something that's ever changing and adapting to
Sure.
How voters are voting now. And we have one more question from Ralph. I think this is going off his last question about the two-party system. Here's an interesting hypothetical. What if political parties were banned and instead every candidate would be an independent with a small I, thus requiring each voter to study and investigate each candidate's platform and vote for the candidate that has the most platform points that the particular voter supports?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question to posit. First and foremost, I think that idea would violate the First Amendment, because we have the freedom to associate with whom we wish. If you want to join a club, join a club. If you don't want to join a club, don't join a club. If you want to join a political party, you can. If you don't want to, you can't. So I think the idea that you would ban political parties would run afoul of the First Amendment, number one. If that was not a problem, if the Supreme Court said, no, you're right, political parties are balderdash, we've got to do it a different way, well, then what kind of candidates would we get? Would we have a party system where someone could become a neighborhood PC and then work through their legislative district to become, a vice chair of a county party, and then maybe a chair of a county party, and maybe work into the legislature? Folks who are not connected originally politically, who are not able to fund their own campaigns? What kind of people would be able to have access if we did not have the mechanisms by which folks with more difficult socioeconomic circumstances personally would be able to move forward? Folks who worked, how many teachers would be able to run for public office in that sort of a setting? How many, bus drivers? How many folks who don't have the traditional means by which right now a lot of candidates move up? We've got folks on school districts boards and school boards in the legislature who are not personally wealthy, but they have political parties behind them. They can get connected through those networks, and they can have folks work to get them in there. And what that gives us is a diversity of opinions in our political systems. It gives us a diversity of experiences and so forth. And I think that's a really good thing. Now, am I cheerleading for political parties? No. Please don't take that as me saying, oh, political parties are great. I myself have advocated and did advocate against my own party when the Democrats in Arizona did not want to open the presidential preference election to independent voters. I introduced the resolution to try to make that happen and was defeated in that because I think more people should be engaged and more people should vote. And not unlike that sentiment, I think the political parties have a lot of control and can have a ton of influence. But they also, there's two sides to that coin. I don't have a solution. It's not something that I've put a hell of a lot of brain power into. I'm much less on the political side of things and much more on the administration, sort of the technocrat side of things, is what I look at, Ralph. So thank you for that question. And with that, Julian, I think I'll move to the next issue, which was what has changed in the voting process over time. Well, I did discuss a little bit of that at the top with the idea of the secret ballot. We used to, as I indicated, folks used to just ask, who are you voting for? And the local registrar at the courthouse steps would just kind of tally it up right there as people were sitting there talking. You'd walk up, you'd tell the registrar who you were voting for, and that was the election. We moved into a situation where folks would gather at their precinct polling place, which again might have been a fraternal organization hall or a church basement or a pub. And, if you're voting for candidate A, stand over here. And if you're voting for candidate B, stand over here, just like some of the caucuses happen in a lot of states right now. Then we moved to balloting, where the political parties would issue a ballot and you would cast your vote and you'd stick it in the box, or voters would bring in their own sheets of paper with the names of their candidates and their choices written out on them. You'd see them published in newspapers. You'd see them published by the political parties on different colors, pieces of paper and so forth. We saw a lot of that. The idea of stuffing the ballot box was never an idea when the government was printing ballots. It was an idea when the political parties were printing ballots. Eventually, it got to the point where the various county governments across the United States who actually run elections. States don't run elections. Counties run elections. Counties, parishes, towns, municipalities, they're the ones that do the hard work, but for a couple of exceptions. For example, on that side of things, what has evolved, this idea that the Secretary of State runs elections. That's not true. The Secretaries of State don't run elections. They're regulators. They come in and test equipment. They make sure that everybody is getting their filings in on time. They make sure that the results get compiled from the various counties into a state result. And they publish a state canvass based on the county's canvass. So it's a really sort of the report to agency is what the Secretary of State is. But the Secretary of State doesn't train poll workers. They don't go out and make sure the facilities are appropriate. They don't print ballots. They don't register voters. No, the Secretary of State doesn't register voters. All those voter registrations go straight to the counties because the county recorder is the registrar. And so a lot of the ways that we vote have changed. We used to have these big, giant machines that were mechanical on the inside, and you'd pull a lever, and it was this big kind of a rigmarole. We had the punch cards for a while. Those of you who remember the year 2000 will never forget the hanging chads from the old digital punch card machines. And we went to a lot of optical scan, and now we're using software. The system in Maricopa County right now actually takes an image of the ballot and tabulates from the image, preserving the ballot in sequence so that if there's an audit or some kind of a hand count or something like that, you can compare the results of the image scan tabulation to the actual ballot themselves, which is a great system. It works really, really well. It's very efficient. It's very fast. So there's a lot of things that have changed about elections over time. And the way that we vote has changed a lot over time. But one thing I want to make a point here about is the politics has not changed. You know, we clutch the pearls when somebody says, "Oh, this person this and that candidate that." Boy, you know, I wonder what people would think today if, like in I want to say it was 1872, two candidates for a borough presidency in New York City were going at it so hard that one burned the other in effigy on the street the night before the election. Now, what does that mean for those of you who don't know what that means? They basically got a caricature dressed in human clothes, right? A straw man, like a scarecrow type of thing, so human clothes, with the opponent candidate's name, like a big name tag, put them up on a fake gallows and burnt it in the street as sort of this kind of protest, like this guy's bad enough that he needs to be burned in the street. Can you imagine the hue and cry? What a horrible thing that is. And that was in 1870, right? So let's kind of dispense with the. I tell people all the time, American politics is a rough game. It always has been a rough game, right? And we pretend like we have this genteel past of, oh, we used to be so civilized. That's nonsense. That is the most ridiculous thing in the world. And all you got to do is read some stuff from the old days where they were really, really mean to each other. They would talk about each other's moms and each other's kids. It was really bad. And that's not to say that it's okay. I'm not advocating for it. But if you're not willing to scrap it up, boy, we're a fighting nation. We're born out of revolution, and we have a very violent history. We've been at war all the time, and that's just who we are as a people. And I know a lot of people who try to, you know, say, "Oh, that's not who we are." Yeah, it is. It is, and it's reflected in our leadership, and it's reflected in our politics. And Julianne, I'm gonna go off screen, but I will still be here to listen to your question real quick because I've got to grab my charger. I apologize, but I'm just gonna switch over to my picture so you guys don't see me running around here real quick.
No problem.
But I'm still here.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to ask some of the questions in the Q&A. We got one from Claudia right before we dived into your next section. She's asking a follow-up question about the insurrection we were talking about. Yes, there was an insurrection at the Capitol, and yes, we should be very concerned about that attempt to end the working of democracy. But what to do when almost half of the country at this point, several months later, seems not to believe that there was an insurrection at all? It was a quote-unquote regular tourist visit. How to counter the intensive spreading of disinformation to the point where the US population can't even agree on a basic fact about the event that happened on January 6th?
That's a great question, and it's a new question. I think that there are commentators and opinion writers and editors and reporters and politicians and leaders across the United States of America who are wrestling with that very question right now. In fact, this is not the first time I've heard this question in the last week and a half. It comes up every time. And I've kind of thought about it a bit. Well, first of all, nobody has the right answer because we don't know what the right answer is. We're in the middle of something new. We're in the middle of something challenging that we have never, ever, ever experienced before in this country. This is truly a challenge. And this is an existential threat. It is a real threat. And we have to do something about it. So it is a timely and a good question. My gut tells me, however, that there are a lot more people out there who believe the truth than who don't believe the truth. I think when you look very carefully at a lot of the numbers, when they say, oh, you know, X number of people who are surveyed say they don't even believe that Joe Biden won the election. Well, okay, How many actual Americans is that? What's the actual population of the country that feels that way, right? It's about something different. And let me use this example. How many Americans believe that there are UFOs? That there are aliens somewhere, and by aliens I mean extraterrestrial influences, visitors, people. There's some kind of something out there. A lot of Americans believe that. Is there evidence? Well, there's a lot of rumor and there's a lot of innuendo, and there are some kind of confirmed and some not. And you can build a lot of stuff around that. But is it real? Is it real? I don't know. I don't know for sure. What I do know is that Joe Biden won the election. That is a provable fact. And with that provable fact on our side, and when I say on our side, again, I don't mean it politically, I mean it on the side of reasonable people, you can really see a crumbling, a very slow crumbling of that mythology in front of us. Let's just use an example from here in Maricopa County, for example. One of the board members on the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors had been very, very, very critical of my administration for political reasons, just raw political reasons. I don't hold that against him personally. He just didn't like me, didn't like my politics. Okay, cool. During the course of my administration, he worked really hard to try to discredit me politically. And in doing so, he really injured the reputation of the election department in the eyes of a lot of folks. Okay, he was taking a risk. That's fine. Just a day and a half ago, he and the other 4 supervisors of different parties had to stand up and defend the system. They had to stand up and speak out for the system because they know the system is good. He knew the system was good all along. He knew the system that we engineered and we built in a bipartisan way that he voted for is a good system. He couldn't help himself, though, during the course of that time to make, political wisecracks and try to dig at my administration and so on and so forth. And again, this isn't sour grapes. This is just what the reality was. It's not dissimilar, I think, at the national level. I think we're starting to see, particularly with the vote today in the House of Representatives, a crack. Today in the U.S. Congress in the House of Representatives, it was just a few hours ago, 35 Republicans joined all of the Democrats in approving the creation of a January 6th commission to investigate the sedition. Now, if you had asked the question 2 weeks ago whether or not you could get one Republican to vote for it, the answer might have been no. But the BS is weighing heavy on that side of the political aisle. I think the worst thing that's happening to the mythology of the stolen election, to the big lie, the worst thing that's happening to the big lie is the fact that they're trying to prove that it's true, right? They're trying to prove through this sham of an audit that the big lie is true. And the truth is always going to win. It's just how it happens. And when you have actual provable facts, you're going to end up on the right side of things. So am I saying don't do anything about it? No. You've heard me use some very strong language today because that's what I'm doing about it. I am making sure that people realize that January 6th was not just an insurrection. It was a failed coup, an attempt to overthrow the American government. We had to have people barricading the doors into the chamber of the people's house, physically stopping the mob from coming in and violating the place. So we can't be genteel and kind about the protection and defense of our democracy. We cannot. We have to be assertive about that. But do I have a better recipe than that? Do I have a better solution to talk to your neighbors or your crazy Uncle Fred who's a QAnon guy or any of that stuff? Nope, I don't. And I'm not going to pretend like I do. All I can do is rest on the work that we did in 2017 and 2018, looking at the old system, figuring out what needed to be changed, and then 2019 and 2020, implementing those changes and really succeeding. I can rest on that work with a lot of pride. The truth is going to prevail at the end, because mythologies just don't stand when people want to know really what happened. They just don't stand.
Adrian, we are kind of in the last few minutes, and I do want to hear more about the role of the county recorder, like who the people on the ground are and how the voting process can be, improved looking forward. So if you
Sure,
can talk a little bit about that, and we can get to some of the questions at the end too.
of course, and I'll be quick because I just took a look at the time. So the Maricopa County Recorder is the holder of the permanent record, right? When you sell a house, we record it. When you register to vote, we record it. When you do vote, we record it. We're the place where all of the records are held permanently. And so far as voting is concerned, the county recorder is the registrar of voters. Now, why is that? Well, as I explained earlier, the franchise goes back to the time when people who owned land could vote. And who had the record of the landowners? The county recorder. So the record of the landowners was the record of voters. That's why the county recorder is the registrar of voters today. It connects historically, although today we don't see owning land and voting as even in the same wheelhouse. They seem completely opposite, but that's why it's the same office. The county recorder makes sure that all of early voting works well in Arizona. In many counties in Arizona, the county recorder does not work with the elections department. In fact, in Pima County, where I was the interim chief deputy, I'm not anymore. We were just helping the new recorder transition in. I think the bio I might have, you might have is about a month out of date. But the election department is separate. In fact, in the building, in the warehouse building where the ballots are processed, the early ballots are actually signature verified in one room, and the ballots are removed and slid through a wall. And they've got little windows in the wall to the election department to tabulate those ballots. And then they have a method of auditing the number of the ballots that go through. And that's because the envelopes are where the signatures of the voters are. So the registrar takes care of the recorder, takes care of the early vote regarding the signature verification and the registration to make sure those voters are actually voters, but then gives the ballots to the election department. That's an extreme example. In many other counties, they're a lot more closely aligned. And in Maricopa County, the election department had been given completely to the county recorder. We broke that up to get closer to the statutory scheme, where the Board of Supervisors is really the election board over the election department, but the county recorder maintains all jurisdiction over early voting and voter registration and some of that other stuff. So we actually, during my administration, split up what had been completely concentrated in one partisan political office because it's a better government model to have those things split up. And that was 55 years on that had been happening. So we shifted that a little bit. And the county recorder does, gosh, what else does the county recorder do? That's it. Just like hold paper, hold records, and run elections. It seems simple, but it's a pretty complicated job.
Great. Thank you so much. Do we want to just get to a couple last questions in the last few minutes?
Sure. I'll be quick with my answers.
Brenda's asking about the voter suppression bills that are being rolled across the country, over 350 and counting. Is this going to be a state-by-state battle, or is it going to be the Supreme Court who protects the right to vote? Purging legitimate voters from the rolls is scary.
There is a concerted, concentrated, and coordinated effort across the United States of America to suppress the vote. It is a cynical attack against our democracy, and it is emerging specifically from the seditionist wing of the Republican Party. And remember, not all Republicans believe in this stuff. Let's be very clear about that. I don't know that we can depend on the Supreme Court, but there is another option. HR 1 and S1, the For the People Act, that is working its way through Congress. It's in the United States Senate right now, and is a comprehensive piece of legislation that the Constitution contemplates, because Congress can regulate the manner by which elections are run. It's right there in Article 1, Section 4. Just read it carefully in the Constitution. The idea that we have to depend on the courts is a bad idea. It's a bad idea. The better idea is get state legislatures elected across the country that are not going to suppress the vote. That's a much better idea. And so what can we do about it? We can register more voters, we can get the word out there, and we can pressure politicians to keep their grubby paws away from our votes, because it's our votes that tell them whether or not they can stay in office, what policies they should run. We're the ones with the power. We should be using the power of our voice through our vote. So.
Great. And that kind of, emphasizes again why voting matters and why it's important. We have one last question in the Q&A from Jeannie. Is there a possibility that voting equipment can be manipulated at the Arizona Fairgrounds?
Yes. Specifically at the Fairgrounds, absolutely, because nobody knows what the heck those guys are doing. They're not running an audit that is in any way, shape, or form meeting any standards of auditing that anybody knows of. They did not have clear and well laid out procedures or policies to begin with. They did not have good security. They did not have good protocols. They don't even understand the EMS, the election management system, to the point where when they tweeted out that Maricopa County had deleted a bunch of files, the actual photograph that they used showed that the system they were using was looking in the wrong place for those files, and that their error was right there on the screen for people to see. If you follow the Arizona data guru, Garrett Archer, on Twitter, or even the Maricopa County Twitter feed at Maricopa County, they've got some great explainers that they've been putting out to help people understand that. So can the voting equipment be manipulated at the Fairgrounds? Yes. And that's why everything that Maricopa County is doing right now is in conjunction with Dominion Voting Services, who is going to ensure that before anything else gets used in any other elections in the future, that they've got those things locked up. And again, of course, all of the equipment is always recertified every year with one mandatory logic and accuracy test ahead of time. And the Maricopa County does another one after every election, just as a safeguard. It's a really, really, really good system. And I can't take credit for everything, and I won't. My predecessor did a lot. I think could have done a lot more. And my successor has recognized the work that we've done, and he's continuing on the projects that we had left, better website architecture, better voter registration system. He's working on those things right now. So it is the career professionals in that office that are driving things. But I am concerned with what's happening with the ballots, what's happening with the voter data, and all of the other stuff. Not so much the tabulation equipment, but all of the rest of the information that's out there in the hands of the cyber ninjas. That bothers me quite a bit. And I think this whole thing needs to stop.
Thank you so much, Adrian. We are at 7 o'clock now, but thank you for that wonderful talk and for answering everyone's questions. And I also want to thank our audience for attending tonight. And I do want to echo Brenda's sentiment in the chat, just letting you all know Arizona Humanities is nonpartisan, and we welcome all voices in this discussion. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And I do want to make a quick plug. Next week, we have our final program in the Representation Series Matters. We're going to have political theorist and Harvard professor Daniel Allen talking about how to build community and be civically engaged in the digital world. She'll be in conversation with Matthew Whitaker, the founder of the ASU Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. It should be a really good talk. That's going to happen on May 26th at 4 p.m. So if you haven't registered already, I think you should go ahead and check that out because it should be really fun. And there is going to be a quick survey at the end of this webinar. Once I close it, you'll have the option to complete it. It's really quick, 4 multiple choice questions. So if you have some time after this, I'd really appreciate it if you could fill that out. But thank you everyone for attending tonight and for our wonderful talk. Have a good night.